Hi all. Well, I think we've had some fun with the book discussion, and it's time now to get back to the regular part of the course where I'm going to be lecturing. The one I want to do to begin with is really a lot of review. I know some of you took off for spring break a little bit early and you missed that last lecture. So just want to cover a few points there, in the talk I'm going to give right now. It's going to be relatively short. Some of it's going to be review, some of it I'm going to extend a few things. But before we get started, just a few thoughts. I know these are really difficult times. So please keep me in the loop. There's a lot I can do. I'm willing to work with you. But if you don't keep me in the loop, there's just really not much that I can do. I'll try and reach out to you if I don't hear from you. But please keep me informed as to what's going on. There's a lot happening in the labor markets right now. As I'm recording this, it's about 1:30 on Thursday, April 2nd. Data on what are called new claims for unemployment is always released on Thursday. Lately, before the last couple of weeks, the new claims, in other words, people saying, hey, I just lost my job. I want to get unemployment compensation, unemployment insurance. It was running about 250,000 new claims a week. If you go back to the Great Recession, it hit all-time highs of about 750,000. Last week, when the data was released on Thursday, the data is always about the previous week. So last week was data for the week before. It hit 3.3 million. Wow. We went from about 200,000 up to about 3.3 million. A huge jump. This morning, the figures were released for last week, and the number was over 6 million. So these have been some really big jumps in unemployment. People have been losing their jobs, and they are filing for unemployment insurance. Tomorrow, Friday, at 8:30, the unemployment rate for March will be released. The survey is always done with the week of the 12th. If I have to make a guess, I'm going to guess that unemployment is going to go up a bit, but the real layoffs didn't hit till later in the month. So I'm going to guess that it's going to go up somewhat, but you're going to see a major jump when the data comes out about a month from now, after the course is over. Sometimes people ask me to project what's going to be happening in the future, and I think that not only depends upon what happens with the corona, the COVID-19 virus, but it also happens on what the Fed is going to do, what the federal government is going to do. As Professor Simon might have taught you in monetary and fiscal policy, it will depend on the monetary and fiscal policy that we follow, as well as what's going to be happening with the virus itself. So economists make predictions a lot of times because people ask us to. But I honestly, at this point in time, don't know what's going to happen. The irony is I volunteered to go on a radio show, so I'm going to have to make predictions even though I really don't know what's going on. Anyway, let's return back to the course material. I want to talk about firm-specific training. We talked about that, and this is where you get a skill that's of really use to only one firm. It's kind of hard to come up with a pure example of firm-specific training. It does exist. I told you about my friend who worked for Nationwide, and she was programming on a legacy computer system. Nationwide was the only one using that computer system. It had been modified tremendously through the years. The bottom line is, all the stuff she learned to do on that legacy computer was of great use to Nationwide Insurance, but to no other company. So sure, there's some general skills, learning how to program in general, but much of it was specific just to Nationwide. I told you the story about my former student who worked at the American Girl Museum. She knew the backstory of every doll in that museum, of great use to the American Girl Company, of very little use to anybody else. And you can think of a case where, let's say, somebody working at a bank, they might know the customers very well. If they were to leave, the customers won't follow them, so that's firm-specific knowledge. But you could make an argument. Some of that would be general knowledge, just knowing how to deal with customers. So skills like that exist very rarely in a pure firm-specific manner. But here's the key. If the employee gets no training, maybe their marginal revenue product and their wage rate is $30,000 a year. However, if you can give that employee firm-specific training, you're giving them a skill that's of use only to one firm. what happens is while they're being trained, their marginal revenue product, what they contribute is lower than $30,000. The firm is absorbing the training costs. But once that employee is trained, let's say they get hired at 22, maybe after about 5 years, they're worth at least 30,000. But after that, they're of a great deal of use to that firm. So here's the catch. You've given an employee skills, a marginal revenue product that's quite high, but you've given them skills that are only of use to you. You don't have to pay them what they're worth. You just got to pay them more than anybody else. So you might increase the wage over time to keep them, but all this area here between the marginal revenue product and the wage rate, that's extra profit for the firm. So what that means is if, and this is a big if there's firm-specific training, you don't want to let your workers go during a recession. But if it's a situation where there's no firm-specific training, think of an example, people that are working picking crops. If you know how to pick broccoli, it doesn't matter where you're picking it. There's no reason to keep people on. There's nothing firm-specific about them. But if you have a business where firm-specific training is important, you want to do everything you can to keep those workers. Now, that being said, sometimes what we see is that job ladders wind up developing. A job ladder is a sequence of jobs. They can be relatively closed. They can be relatively closed. So, for example, you might enter in a shipping department as a packer, and then you would go up the job ladder. You could go from a packer to a local driver to a long-distance driver to a dispatcher. The reason we call this closed is the only way to enter is at the bottom. You will do this because if employees enter, they're going to stay because they know the only way to get to the good jobs is to enter at the bottom and stay. So the firm will say, okay, here's the deal, here's the incentive. We want to give you this training, we want you to stay. You enter at the bottom, and this is how you rise up. We're not going to hire anybody from outside, from the external labor market. We can speak of a port of entry. That means where you enter the job. And sometimes there's an open job ladder. Firms have to decide what it is that they want. This might have got cut off, I apologize, but you might start in marketing as a social media coordinator. There's a lot of jobs you could start out in, advertising, account manager, whatever. And if you do well, you will rise to become a marketing manager, but they'll also hire marketing managers from outside. And if you do well, you might rise to director of marketing, but they hire somebody from outside as well. You might rise to become a vice president of marketing, and finally the CMO, the chief marketing officer. There might be a vice president of marketing and advertising and other similar things here, but the idea here is you can move up the ladder, but when I say it's open, there's a number of different areas, a number of different levels that you can enter. So a firm has to decide, here's the trade-off. If you keep it closed, people will stay with you, and you'll retain that very valuable, firm-specific human capital. But you might not have the best person if you're not hiring externally. But you'll keep people and you'll get that firm-specific human capital. If you don't think there's much firm-specific, then what you can do is you can hire at any level, and people will be moving from one job or one firm to the other. So internal labor markets, that's what we're looking at here. These are groups of jobs in a firm that are filled through internal promotion rather than hiring from external labor markets. So, for example, in the shipping department, filling all the jobs internally. That's an internal labor market. Now, if you are going to fill internally and not hire from outside, how are you going to do it? Now, you might say, let's give people tests, let's figure out who's the best person to do it. But a lot of firms will use what's called seniority. In other words, they give the position to the person who's been there the longest. You might not get the best person filling the job, but the result is if people don't have to fear training someone else, they're willing to train them. So for example, when I was in college, I worked in a steel mill. The day you started, you were given a badge, and the badge numbers were issued sequentially. Whenever there was an opening, whoever wanted the job that had the lowest badge number, the most seniority, got it. So nobody was afraid of teaching you things because they knew there was no way they could take your job unless they didn't want to take, that you couldn't get a job they were up for unless they didn't want that job. So the thing with internal labor markets and seniority, it promotes training. That's good for a firm in the long run. But the problem is they might not get the very best person in the short run. Hey, that's what life's all about. You got to make trade-offs. Now, within an internal labor market, one of the things that we see is custom. The unwritten set of rules that determine what happens within an internal labor market. Let me give you some examples. Custom, unwritten. If you work at a place, will you get fired for fighting? Think about the example in the book we just read, Cut Loose. Somebody got really mad in Windsor that they were making fun of his ethnic heritage, and he clocked the guy. He punched him out. Was he fired? No. The supervisor said, hey, that guy really had it coming. If you're hurt on the job, will they find you another place, maybe a desk job as sometimes happened, or will they just let you go? The answer here is custom. What are people used to doing? You listen to what some of the women reported in that book, Cut Loose. Now let me say, and we'll talk more about this when we get to discrimination later on, sexual harassment is flat out illegal. Can't do it. But does it happen? Yes. Things sometimes happen in that place called the real world. So can that get you fired? Well, the answer is it should, but it doesn't always. Another thing, confidentiality of salaries. A lot of times an employer will say, we don't want you telling anybody what your salary is. That's unprofessional. Well, unprofessional. One of the reasons is they don't want people comparing salaries and perhaps going to the employer and say, I want, more money. Now, they can tell you they're going to fire you if you reveal your salary. I think that's against the law. But, the question is, if you violate it, will the firm fire you? It's not so much here when we talk about custom, what's legal, but the answer, really what we're looking at here is what actually happens on the job floor. So custom is important. It can dictate the amount and the pace of work. When I was in college, once again, I worked as a post office worker. I delivered mail. First day out, I delivered the mail. I was back in almost record time. They took me aside. It was the only time in my life I've ever been called racehorse. They said, racehorse, what are you doing back so soon? I said, I'm done. They said, hey, you're a young kid. When the regular guy comes back to do this route and he has all those packages in Christmas time, they're going to give him more to do. You go back and take a lunch break. I said, I already ate lunch. They said, you go back and take one anyway. The custom was I worked harder than I was supposed to. So I was told, don't work that hard. Now, when you look at things in the real world, what we find out is that large firms, probably some of the ones some of you are going to work for, when you look at the CEOs are generally hired from within. The port of entry is usually lower down, and I was reading an article recently, if you look at Fortune 500 firms in the United States, about 85% of them wind up hiring their CEO from within the firm rather than outside the firm. So this firm-specific knowledge in terms of running a firm is frequently important, but if you can't get somebody who knows the firm, then you have to resort to somebody outside. So having said all that, I leave you now with a very important question. If you only have an internal labor market, if people are promoted from within, how do you set the salaries? How do you figure out what to pay people? How do you can't always figure out their marginal revenue product. So that's going to be the topic of the next talk. Take care, stay well, and I'll be back in a little while with the next video.